Shabbat Shalom. If you have ever taught Hebrew school or ever been a student in a Hebrew school classroom, then you know that one of the greatest set inductions for a discussion on Jewish identity is a deceptively simple question of, is Judaism a religion? Because the preliminary response from the class will often be a resounding yes, or depending on the age of the students, a room full of shrugged shoulders signaling the sentiment of, did the rabbi really just ask a question whose answer is so patently obvious? What is Judaism if not a religion? We have a set of beliefs, festivals, mitzvot, commandments that express the will of God. Of course Judaism's a religion. But then, inevitably, an intrepid student will raise his or her hand and boldly suggest otherwise. Judaism is not a religion. We are a nationality, a people, a race, or otherwise. There are plenty of Jews who don't observe mitzvot, who don't celebrate the festivals, plenty of Jews who are atheists. These Jews are Jews by way of their attachment to other Jews, or perhaps the broader Jewish people, or perhaps the state of Israel. The connection these Jews have to Jews in New York and New Zealand or Netanya is not religious per se, but it reflects a sense of peoplehood, a shared destiny, or in the case of Israel, the nation-state of the Jews. Besides, another enterprising student may say, the question of what Judaism is not a question that is for Jews alone to decide. There are anti-Semites who may see Jews as a race or as a bloodline or an ethnic clan, a claim that makes no sense at all once one meets a Jew who is white, black, brown, or any other color, or for that matter, a convert to Judaism. And it's in that magical moment when that initial shrug of indifference turns to a furrowed brow of intellectual curiosity that the learning begins. A simple question revealed to be not so simple at all. I raise the question, is Judaism a religion, not merely as a set induction, which it will be this afternoon when the teens come to my home for learning, but because I want to suggest that embedded within the answer to this question is the crux to one of the most critical questions facing the Jewish world today, and that is the relationship between Diaspora-Jewry and Israeli Jewry. 452 members of our congregation have just returned from a historic mission to Israel. We're energized, we're educated, we're engaged, and we are inspired. Many of us have also returned filled with questions and some consternation on the prospects for peace, on Israel's ability to house religious pluralism, on the question of how to lovingly embrace and fearlessly defend an Israel that oftentimes acts in breach of the very values, practices, and aspirations at the foundation of the Judaism from which our love of Israel emanates. For those not on the congregational trip to Israel, you don't need to look further than the pages of the New York Times, the Times of Israel, or the Jewish Week to see the discussion bubbling up to the surface. Just a few days ago, a full-page op-ed in the New York Times on the Great Schism, an unbridgeable and perhaps irreparable divide between the two major centers of world Jewry, be it due to the death of the two-state solution, the Israeli disregard for liberal expressions of Judaism within and beyond Israel, or our toxic moment of intersectionality and identity politics on the left and the right. When it comes to the state of Israel, the union of the world Jewish community, we all know, to put it gently, that there is work to be done. This morning, rather than talk about the Kotel or Palestinian autonomy or any other symptom of the frayed relationship, I want to discuss what I believe to be the primary underlying cause for our present dysfunction, and that is the simple yet not so simple question of whether Judaism is a religion. Right about now is a time in the sermon where you have no idea where I am headed. So hang in there, trust me a little, strap on a seatbelt, because in order to understand the present, we need to take a big step backwards. I can't promise that we'll all wrap up neatly in a bow, but I do hope that in the course of the next few minutes, I'll leave you with just the right amount of knowledge and questions unanswered that you may just be prompted to come to my History of Zionism class, which begins Tuesday night. Once upon a time, or at least for nearly 1,800 years, there were only two words that mattered for the Jewish people: Golah, meaning exile, and Geulah, meaning redemption. Jews lived in the Golah, in exile, cast out of their land by the Romans in the year 70, and depending on the context, subject to anything from the good graces or persecutions of their Gentile hosts. We were the other, a community apart, a people who, while granted an element of self-governance, were never granted the opportunity to integrate into civil society. We prayed for Geulah, for a messianic redemptive return to the land, but accepting the direction of our synagogues and prayer, the breaking of glasses at weddings as a remembrance of Jerusalem, and some notable individuals who went to live, die, or be buried in Israel, the return to the land was strictly a theological concept. We were Jews because we were other, as defined by us and those around us. For just shy of 2,000 years, this is how Jews lived, until that fateful day when our good friend Modernity entered the room with his two sidekicks, emancipation and enlightenment, the latter of which we're going to set aside for a moment so we can deal directly with the former. The emancipation shattered all the assumptions of the past centuries. It didn't happen all at once or all in one way, but be it France or Germany or Russia or elsewhere, formally and informally, for the very first time, Jews were granted the opportunity to integrate into civil society. It was a joyous time, no doubt an Oktoberfest to remember. But in the midst of all of the newfound freedoms, a whole lot of new questions came into play. If we were now citizens of our respective countries, then were we still in exile? And if we were now subject to French or German or Russian law, then what became of Jewish self-governance? And if we were no longer a separate and distinct people, then what exactly were we? And it's this point, as the title of Princeton professor Leora Batnitsky's book signals, that Judaism became a religion. No longer a people apart, Jews began to think of themselves as a religion in the Protestant sense of the word. We had our rituals, we had our festivals, we established our synagogues, this one included, no different than our non-Jewish neighbors who had their rituals and their churches. Jews renounced the notion that Judaism was a national identity, and we were now, for example, in the German case, German citizens of the Mosaic faith. It's a story that started with a man named Moses Mendelssohn, and it reached its apotheosis with the Reform Movement's 1885 Pittsburgh platform, which proudly declared, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community." As a religion, Jews were no longer in the Golah, and thus were no longer in need of Geulah, a return to the land. Significantly, this turn to Judaism as a religion was not just limited to the Reform movement. Modern Orthodoxy, a reaction to the Reform movement, was as much a product of the emancipation as anything. The festivals, the dietary restrictions, and otherwise, these too were the religious demands of the religion of Judaism, not in any way contradictory to the secular demands of the modern state. And this is where the story might have ended, except that during those same 1870s and 1880s, as one slice of the Jewish world were building the institutions of diaspora religious life, something else was happening. A whole lot of Jews were coming to realize that the promise of the emancipation had been revealed to be a fraud. Whether it was the anti-Jewish Russian pogroms of the 1880s or the famed French Dreyfus trial of the 1890s, it became increasingly clear that Jews were not really becoming full members of these modern nation states, a thought which we know would be realized in its full horror with the Shoah. All of which is why it's precisely during these years that the earliest Zionist thinkers, Smolensky, Pinsker, and of course Herzl, would pronounce that Judaism was not a religion, but a nation. We are a nation because we are attached to the land. We are a nation because we are attached to each other. We are a nation because the Gentiles will never accept us as part of their nations. The emergence of Zionism in the 1880s wasn't just a rejection of the Enlightenment or the false promise of the diaspora. It was a rejection of the notion that Judaism was a religion. In the years to come, there would be different kinds of Zionism, political, religious, and cultural, each one with its own flavor. But at its core, to paraphrase the cultural Zionist Achad Ha'am, Zionism was here to remind diaspora Jews that they were slaves in their freedom, misguided in their naive belief that they could practice their religion under the false promise of a liberal state. No longer were Jews going to wait for Geulah. Jewish brothers and sisters would now do it for themselves, which is why Pinsker's famous essay is entitled Auto-Emancipation. This is what Zionism was and continues to be, a land without a nation for a nation without a land. So there it is, two notions of what Judaism is, a religion or a nationality, two roads that diverged philosophically and geographically in the 1880s. It is, to be sure, not the only time the definition of Judaism has undergone change. One need look no further than our own Torah reading, as the soon-to-be emancipated Israelites were given a calendar, a set of rituals, dietary laws, a historical memory, and all the accoutrements of a religious identity to replace the glue of shared hardship, which was their national bond for hundreds of years prior. It's not airtight. Diaspora Jewry has had its prophets of peoplehood like Mordechai Kaplan, just as Israel has had its champions of Judaism as a religion, like Yeshayahu Leibovitz. But for the most part, two worlds of Judaism have emerged. American Jews have defined their identities by way of ritual observance or non-observance, the causes of social justice and otherwise. Israelis, religious and secular, see the world totally differently. Israel is a nation surrounded by hostile neighbors. The world is divided into an us and a them, and it's through that lens by which national priorities are determined. For diaspora Jews, the whole point of practicing or not practicing Judaism as a religion is that it serves to prove that Jews can live side by side with their Gentile neighbors. In the eyes of Israelis, such an approach is delusional. Be it Pinsker, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, or Israel's present prime minister, there are only two outcomes for diaspora Jewry: anti-Semitism or assimilation. American Jews bristle at an Israel that not only fails to acknowledge their religious identities, but carries out policies in breach of what they believe Judaism to be all about. Israelis have neither the time nor the inclination to make sense of the choices of American Jews, which, with a few notable exceptions like Pittsburgh, are being made in the most comfortable circumstances in which Jews have ever existed. Israelis are choosing not to care about their diaspora religionist cousins, and diaspora Jews are choosing to stop defending a state of the Jews whose nationalistic expressions of Judaism no longer reflect the very religion that they hold dear. And it is a cycle that goes on and on and on. There is no question an emergent schism between American and Israeli Jewry. But we miss the point if we think it's just about the Kotel, the two-state solution, cozy up with authoritarian European governments. Cozy up with authoritarian European governments. The schism is about two fundamentally different understandings of Jewish identity. and the emergence of two communities which, no different than Sephardic and Ashkenazic communities, reflect different contexts in which we function. We know we're related. In theory, I think we'd like to get along, but in practice, it's really, really hard. And because one is not right and one is not wrong, but because we see the world, or more specifically, our Judaism, in very different ways. I wish I had an easy fix, but I don't. There are real knots to untangle, and at the end of the day, I pray that American Jewry and Israeli Jewry will continue in strength, which by definition means that they'll continue to grow in their own directions. Perhaps, like any good therapy session, the best we can do at this point is simply to admit to the problem, acknowledge each other for who we are, listen to each other even if we don't always agree, and try our very best not to project our own shortcomings onto our partner, who is hopefully just doing their level best to deal with their own problems. A final thought. These last few weeks, both in Israel and since we've returned, I've been asked by many congregants, many people, community leaders, and journalists, both Israeli and American, as to why we as a synagogue, and I personally, have not thrown a flag or leveraged a platform of Park Avenue Synagogue or as a 450-strong mission to Israel to protest the wrongs that I see taking place in Israel. It's a fair question, and the story, to be sure, is yet to be fully written. But for the moment, my answer is that when you're faced with a relationship that's in need of repair, in our actual families or in the wider Jewish family, one can choose to pick and tear it apart, or one can choose to lean in by way of expressions of love, by way of earned trust, and by way of the belief that by having a seat at the table, we are actually better positioned to effectuate change. I am well aware, I promise you, of the problems facing American and Israeli Jewry. There are few topics that I think about more. We have two different worlds of Judaism, and right now we are talking past each other. I have chosen, and by extension this synagogue has chosen, to lean in. I am choosing to work for that day when American Jewry and Israeli Jewry are able to retrieve a common language, when we acknowledge not just our shared past, but also our shared destiny, when we come to realize that Judaism is both a religion and a nationhood. That redemptive day is not yet upon us, but it is a day worth working towards and worth fighting for. As one wise person said, if you will it, it is no dream. Shabbat Shalom.